beginning. Actually, he has a show called Strange Fruits. It's actually will open tomorrow night. So we are so glad to have him here to give a talk. I think maybe about your show and some about your painting. And then we also get Susan May here. She's artist director from White you're based in London, right? So just give the time to Michael and just welcome Michael to come here. And just for your information, today mostly the audience in different level, MFA or degree course, and from different major, painting, photography, sculpture, maybe some ceramic students. So I'm sure we will learn a lot from your experience. And yeah, just welcome, Michael.
Thanks for coming along as well. Do you guys mind if I sit down just so I can see this? I'm not going to yeah? Is that okay?
Yes. So you want to start with the slide? So
yeah, that would be great. What I'm going to go through is the group of paintings that are in this show of White Cubes. They're all made in the last year, and the title of the show is Strange Fruit, which is also the title of one of the paintings in the show. To start, I thought what I would do is start at the beginning, which is the surface of the paintings. It's a little bit hard to tell from these paintings. So this first image is a painting called La Semanawe. It's 3.3 meters by 2.2 meters. The paintings are made on material called labugo bark cloth, which is cloth that's made by stripping the outside of a tree and then beating it until it turns into a soft cloth. I started thinking about the cloth because I wanted a material to place the paintings in East Africa. So the history was part of the history of that part of the world, which is where the culture that I grew up in is from. I also wanted a material that would destabilize the paintings that I was making. So the languages that I could use, which reference a lot of Western art history paintings, would only be working as references. It wouldn't mean that I would have to deal with, for example, I wouldn't have to deal with German expressionist paintings if I made an expressionist mark. I wanted to be able to take from those languages and in some instances critique the languages or subvert elements of the language, but also build up my own kind of language within that. So I started thinking about when I found a surface that I wanted to work with, working on it began to change how I painted. Initially I was painting with quite thick paint, but the surface, because it has a lot of holes, it's got a lot of texture like bark of a tree, it would break the mark that I was making. And so it meant that I started to paint quite thinly. And if you have time to see the work, they're made with a lot of thin layers of paint building up, and then rubbing down and building up again. And that's just to incorporate the surface into the painting and for it to interrupt the images that are there as well. A painting to start with, that was because he was the sort of foremost artist who dealt or made images about the tropics, and I was interested in how exoticization dumbs down culture, and particularly the part of the world where I'm from. And again, I wanted to try and use the language that has been used to represent that part of the world in a way that incorporates the more subtle and complicated elements of our culture. This painting is part of a group of paintings which are made about dance. called Baikoko. Baikoko is a dance that's performed by women for women. It's used to be mainly for sort of before wedding ceremonies, and it's in a very Muslim part of the country that's very conservative, and so the women are fully clothed, but the dance itself is incredibly sexual. I came across the dance in a pop musician called Diamond Platnumz, who is one of the main protagonists of a movement called Bongo Flava. I came across this dance in that, and he was just using them to tell part of the story of his song Nasema Nawe. So I made these drawings of the dances, and in this body of work, one of the threads that runs through them all is looking into sexual expression and sexual censorship in East Africa. With Bongo Flava and with Baikoko, the government, because of the sexual nature of the movements of the dance, they banned the use of Baikoko dances in all music videos, and subsequently the dancers themselves were pushed out of contemporary society. In this painting, I was thinking about having a sort of relationship to this Paul Gauguin painting here. I was interested in two aspects of it. One was the way that the position of the women who are looking at the painting, looking at the angel and Jacob, and then also the perspective of it, how you're in this kind of lifted up above the women's heads. So I started thinking about that, but I didn't want it to be. I wanted each of these figures to be the groups of figures to be in their own world and kind of involved in the dance that they were doing. The second one in the series is this painting, which is called Baikoko on the mouth of the Mwachema River, to reflect upon the nature of the sort of exclusion of the Baikoko dances from the East African culture, in particular the Tanzanian and Dar es Salaam culture. I started thinking about the way that witches have been excluded from society and perceived and talked about. And so when I was making the drawings of the dancers from the pop video, they began to look a little bit like the witches in Goya's paintings, he's another artist I look at a lot. He always, for some reason, he often makes the witches hold their knees up to their chest when they're flying. Like, I suppose it's like a bird. So I was looking at this painting and thinking about this painting, and thought that I would make a sort of use the compositional elements. So with the river, the hills, the trees, and compose this. One of the things that I've also been thinking about with the Baikoko paintings is in Degas' paintings, the language that he used to represent dances. So in the ground, the red ground, and also in parts of the women's clothing, it's built up with a lot of short strokes that come from looking at Degas. It's evolved into something a little bit different, but that's where it was. The other element of the work in all of these is the patterning on the women's clothes. I had wanted something that again would look back to older aspects of different cultures in East Africa. So I had found a book where people who had used the same cloth that I'm painting on, they would make these little charcoal drawings on them. So I used the patterns and the images on those charcoal on the cloths to decorate all the women's clothing. So it just had kind of brought it back into older aspects of East African culture. and this is the last in the Baikoko Dances series. So this painting, Strange Fruit, which is where the title of the show comes from, was made thinking about an aspect of Kenyan society, which is that between 60 and 70% of our population is under the age of 25, which means that in a place where we have very few jobs, it means that the youth, the young population, are mostly jobless. What started happening on our coast again is that the younger parts of society who had finished school and were looking for jobs and couldn't get them, they decided to start accusing the older generation, so their parents and grandparents, of witchcraft, which meant that the societies that they were in would kick them out. And then I had been thinking about this but couldn't find an image that had a sort of subtlety and a different way of talking about it. Then I came across a story in the papers where a woman had her husband was accused of witchcraft by the younger parts of the community. The elders then had the man stoned to death, and the wife of the man who was killed hung herself in her grief. And this was done again so that the young guys could come and take their job and take their land. So I started thinking of having this image of a woman who's hung herself, but I didn't want it to be immediately obvious what was happening in the painting. And so I kind of was thinking of it being a position where maybe like if you were lying on the ground and looking up at the sky and sort of daydreaming, you would see this thing in the tree that was like a flower or something. And then slowly you would realize it's the feet of a woman. So in the top left, there's the slightly green feet and the yellow that you can see of her clothing of this woman who's hung herself. And the tree is a bamba coffee tree, which is very common to the area where this happened. This painting is called Necklacing. The sort of origins of this painting, for me, are about 20 years ago. When I was much younger, I was standing outside a cinema in Nairobi waiting to be picked up with a friend of mine, and a guy came running past. He was fully clothed, but he came running past with a tire around him. And very shortly after, sort of 20-30 seconds after, he was followed by a large group of, a large gang of like both men and women who were running after him. This, at the time, it was just a surreal and quite funny thing to see. But later on, I found out that what was happening is that people who would steal and would get caught stealing would then be beaten up in mob justice. And sometimes, in extreme cases, they would have a tire put around them and it would be lit, so they would burn alive and burn to death, as a form of punishment to say to other thieves, don't do this. This also happens in West Africa. It happens a lot with witches. They do that with people who are accused of witchcraft. They'll put a tire around them and burn them. Because of the way that I first encountered it, I was thinking of trying to bring that humor and how surreal that image was into the painting. So I started thinking of trying to use his expression of the figure and his body to shift the darkness of the act into somewhere a bit more surreal, and perhaps a little bit more disarming for the viewer, or certainly for me as a viewer. So this is why he's got this slightly absurd grin on his face, and he's also covering himself. again, this was also the drawings for this. I was thinking about how Goya represents a lot of the horrific things in his paintings. The people are often smiling, and they've got an absurd grin on their face. So that was another tie to Goya in this. So this painting is called Malira Gardens. I'm coming back to thinking about sexual expression and censorship. I had come across this story of this park bench in Western Kenya, and on the bench, couples would go in their lunch breaks, to get it on, basically. And the police, instead of catching the couples and arresting them, they set up a hidden camera, and they filmed them over 2 weeks and released all of the footage on social media. So what you ended up with are these, like, sometimes quite poetic love stories of these couples. You don't know the relationship. You don't know if it's man and wife. You don't know if it's an affair. You don't know if it's paid for. You don't know what it is. But you would have, like, this particular couple were quite comical because he was always very aware of the fact he was doing this in public. So he would always come with a pot of yogurt, and they would sit and they would share this pot of yogurt together. And then he was always kind of coercing her, but very self-consciously and looking around the whole time. Then whenever she finally submitted, and they were doing it, like in the middle of things, he was always like looking behind himself. And so this seemed like quite a kind of another absurd side of it all. So then animals feature quite heavily in my work, but they're usually, and monkeys in particular. And I just thought of having these baboons observing, like either as you and me as the viewer, or in the way that the police were, or just as that. So that's what's happening, and the pose is taken directly from the photographs. It's very literal. Again, thinking of sexuality within the culture, I came across this interview with a shaman from the tribe that make the cloths that I'm working on, and he was talking about putting people into trances and why you would do that. And he gave an example of somebody that came to him who wanted to gain more power in their life, and he said that he would have to go with them, firstly to show them how to do it. And he gave this example of an eland, which is for them their sort of symbol of power. An eland is like a very large antelope, basically. He would have to go with them because other animals, while you're in a trance state, would come and try and take you off your path. And he gave the example of a beautiful Thompson's gazelle coming out of the bushes and being totally irresistible. And so this person that he was going with wouldn't find the right path for the eland. They would be taken off into the bushes. So I thought in this show of having these monkey figures to seduce you, so she's being seductive. And she's also a bonobo monkey. They're very sexual. This is a baboon in the same vein. Yeah, this is a monkey called a sheath, which I made up, but she's also doing the same thing. So this painting, which is called Waiyaki Way Wetness. Waiyaki Way is one of the main streets in Nairobi. There's, particularly while I was growing up, there were a lot of street boys on the street, like homeless children. and I used to do some work teaching art classes in one of the government schools where a lot of street boys would be brought in by a charity that I was working alongside. And when I got to know a couple of the boys a little bit better, I was told like a little bit more about their lives. And for things like lunch or for breakfast, there would be a hierarchy amongst the street boys, where the older boys would ask for some sort of payment to allow the younger boys to eat, which would often be sexual. So there'd be some sort of sexual favor done to the older boys, and then they would allow them to have their breakfast. I started thinking of an image that would work in this way. So I thought of a mother sort of giving some sort of corrupted food to one of these street boys as an image. So that's kind of where this came from. So she's a wet nurse, and instead of milk, she's giving him lizards. So he's suckling a lizard out of her breast. Yeah, this painting's a little bit more obscure. It's called Sleight of Hand because initially when I made it, I had been looking at a Titian painting where it was of a cardinal who was giving a loaf of bread to a beggar, and I was thinking of this character Sun Wukong. I don't know. Do you guys know Sun Wukong? From sorry? Exactly. I'd come across him a couple years ago, and I liked the fact that he was like this mischievous character who would take on different forms and learn all these things, and would be better at doing it than any of the people, and then would destroy everything. And so he's kind of become, in a way, like the way the monkeys work in my painting is often like him, or like that character. And in this painting, I was thinking of this guy being either like a political figure or something who's assuming this position of cultural knowledge and wisdom, and sort of like in the Titian where the cardinal's handing something. I had initially thought of him like giving something to somebody down there, but you can't quite see him in this painting. So I wanted him to be this two-faced thing with the monkey coming out, which again was thinking, which is why I was talking about Sun Wukong, and then on his shoulder sits an owl. An owl, like commonly, certainly in Western cultures, it's a symbol of wisdom, but then at home it's also a symbol of death. And I liked that doubling up, and again thought of him posturing as this knowledgeable, wise figure. And his cloak again uses the pattern that I was talking about in the Baikoko dances, which is from the guys who used the cloth and painted on it. So again, I was just thinking of him as adopting this position as a sort of knowledgeable cultural figure or political figure. And so the painting's called Sleight of Hand, for all that it stands for. This painting is perhaps the most literal out of all of them, and it's literal in a sense that this is basically an amalgamation of a scene that I saw when I got home. I was over here and I saw this last year. And I saw these little stickers with this figure on it. I was told it's called Melody or something like this. Yeah? Is that right? I don't know. Anyway. Yeah? Is it called Melody? Okay.
It's a Japanese character.
It's a okay, cool. Yeah, like a little funny blow-up rabbit thing. And when I got off the paint, usually I probably wouldn't have noticed it, to be perfectly honest, although it is quite big. There was a guy just on the side of the road selling all these blow-up toys, of which this was one of them, and I found it like an uncanny scene. And at the time, the Pope had just visited Nairobi, So there was a lot of billboards with the Pope on it, and then there was like this thing with the coming from all these blow-up toys are actually brought from mainland China and sold in Nairobi on the streets. And then I was thinking of like we have a sort of a fast-growing middle class who like spend a lot of time on the parks on Sundays. So I thought of setting this up. There are some hills in the back of Nairobi called the Gong Hills, which Gong means knuckles, which are the ones in the back, although they look comical because they're very even, they're actually like that. And so it's just a sort of park setting with all these different things which you would see happening in it. So it's a very literal scene. Throughout this year in this group of paintings, I've been looking at this Japanese printmaker called Kuniyoshi quite a lot, and so a lot of the compositions and figures have been made thinking about that. This one was also heavily influenced by him. In this, I thought of having an octopus that's sort of taking revenge on a fisherman. So like with the other animals where they're kind of appearing in a trance or in a sort of vision, what I thought of this octopus doing was turning its tentacles into doom palms, and of a fisherman kind of out at sea who would maybe see these palm trees and think it's land and sail to it. And then I thought this octopus would then come and eat the fisherman. So the reason I had initially made that is because I was staying by the beach, and I just, every morning at 6 you'd hear this like noise as they would beat the octopus on the sand to get the ink out. And so it's just a very self-indulgent story really. And this again, which is the last in this group of paintings, is about the street boys, and it ties back in where one of the things that the boys do is to get high they sniff glue, and I was thinking of trying to have a way of showing that had something of the relief or very short-lived beauty of a high with the other side of it. So yeah, that's the glue sniffers. Yeah, thank you. If you have any questions, please. Yeah.
I was just wondering how your work's perceived in London, and whether or not there's much of a community from Kenya that doesn't relate to it well, or just the general perception of this.
I'm not sure how to answer that, because I think as an artist you get a very biased opinion of people when they talk to you, so you never really know en masse how it is. But one of the things that I found interesting was when I was in Nairobi, I came across someone who had seen my last show with White Cube in London, and one thing they did say, which I was very happy about, is that the paintings are very specific, and they were surprised to see paintings about home that are so specific about particular stories. Other reactions that I've had from people are, particularly when I've used monkeys doing things that people do, that they find that offensive, which I think is a slight misunderstanding.
Why?
Why do they find it
Yeah,
offensive?
why do you think they find it? Find it humorous?
Racially.
Yeah, racially.
Yeah. I think it's funny, but I don't use it in a way where I'm mocking something. It's literally because of a particular story or narrative. I'm not interested in my work. For me, doesn't deal with race. It hasn't been part of a sort of narrative that I grew up with. Nairobi is very multicultural, and I come from a biracial family, and you know, it's just never been something that I've had. So I don't like. Perhaps it means I don't have a sensitivity when I use things like that. They're very much the topics that I'm interested in, as opposed to dealing with that sort of thing. I don't know, did that answer your question at all?
Will you do any sketch before you
Yeah, exactly. When usually I do all my research for the work in Kenya. So I'll go back and I draw from life. I draw from social media, and sometimes I'll just make things up, and there won't be an image that starts it. Like this is just imagined, and so is that. Whereas this is from photographs. So yeah, and sometimes it varies the amount of the composition will be set beforehand. Like this, the composition hasn't changed from the drawing. Whereas in other paintings, it'll change quite a lot. So it just varies. And often with the drawings, there'll be quite different things, and it'll take a little bit of time for an image to find its place within a work. So, like, sorry, I'm just going to skip through a whole bunch. So like with this painting, I had made the drawing of the tree without thinking of the painting at all, and I didn't know how to use it. And it was only because of the way the cloth worked, which had a lot of wrinkles and holes in it, that it made sense for me to use the tree in that painting. And also because of the relationship to this, that I wanted to hold it, you know, so it really depends. But drawing is the first step. Yeah. Hi, sorry, you were saying?
Oh, yeah, my question was, I was just wondering when you said that your work wasn't about race.
Yeah.
But it seems that your work does engage with issues of culture and identity.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, how do you avoid that discourse given what's happening globally and how race is being played out globally across boundaries? I'm wondering how you avoid that discourse, or your work entering that discourse.
I don't mind if it does enter the discourse, because I don't think, I think that's the kind of unfortunate thing about race, is that, you know, it's often somebody else's perception on you or on this, and then something's adopted and becomes a stand-in for something other than yourself, or like the other. And so, like, I don't, in fact, I'd be very happy for it to be put in that context, because, like, to me that would show it up how absurd the you know, a racial attitude is.
Yeah.
You know, so I don't mind that. I just what I wouldn't like, or the reason that I say that is, for me, like, all these stories are things that happen in culture. It's life. It's very simple. And it's about experience, and I think that is, whether it's in a different location or situation, I think that it's just a common experience. So I don't. Yeah. So I don't mind if it enters it in from that perspective. But I think it would be incredibly limiting to talk about the work from that as that, and I think it's incredibly limiting of culture for everything to be brought back to that, which I think it often does. And yeah, I don't know, does that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool.
Geographic locations that you're referencing in your work, and you know, I mean, I come from Australia, but I studied in the UK, and the UK is very, very grey.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really interested in what your geographic contexts are doing to your palette, or the way that you're using your palette to reference geographic contexts.
I'm not sure what it is doing. I'm not sure what, like, making work in different locations does to the palette, but the palette choices, Okay, like now it's a little bit different because I feel like they've evolved into my own language. But initially they were made thinking about dealing with exoticism and dealing with a dumbing down of culture through exoticism and trying to talk about more subtle and diverse elements of the culture that I grew up in, but using the language that whether or not it was specifically about Kenyan culture or other cultures, is used in a way that exoticizes something. So that was the initial steps. But then, I mean, like if I look at this painting as an example, I mean, you could say it's got a lot to do with that because of the red ground, you know. But then our soil is red. It isn't that red, but it's like red. And it has a lot of other things in it. So I think the thing that makes me think about then is like this interesting slippage that happens when you particularly in sort of like in a tourist situation where you have like something that is a sort of significant part of a culture that's then performed outside of its context, and it becomes something else, but it is also based within that. I think sometimes the color can slip into something that means a lot more, and then into something that doesn't. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Hi.
Most of your paintings are expressionistic, but in the work slides of 10, you put some color square undertones. Is it you do it intentionally or?
The beneath the painting. That's just the photographer to get the colours when he's taking the photo. That I didn't make that. Yeah, I can't take credit for that. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about that. Should have taken that out. Sleight of hand. Sorry.
Sorry, but we came in late because we were in a meeting, but I wondered, could you say anything about the process for the students, the process of going from an art school graduate to someone who's still quite young and having international recognition?
Yeah. We were just Susan and I were just talking about that before, just because it's we didn't talk about it in this context, but like it's an interesting one because I don't think there are two same ways as an artist in things working out. For me, it was. When I finished art school, I knew that the work that I was making is not the work that I wanted to keep on making, and I felt like I had a lot more. I felt like the ideas I was thinking about were there, but the practice wasn't very fulfilling to me. So like I went, I sort of went underground in my own way and spent about. Sort of 2 or 3 years looking for the parts of the work that would then make sense, and then a couple years before I got very lucky, and it really was just luck, and had my first show, which was with White Cube. I had been in a group show before that, in a very small gallery, which I don't know if anybody actually saw that beyond me, the other artist, and the gallery owners. And that, like, it was very difficult. Like, it is difficult to sit and make work by yourself, and not, as I'm sure if anyone has had time outside of art education knows, like, it is very difficult to sit and make work by yourself and have nobody see it and still kind of have the energy to keep going back and keep pushing yourself and keep believing that something may happen. But But the only thing that I could say to that is that, like, it might. And that if you are in a position, or certainly for me it was a matter, when I was in a position where I felt like the work was somewhere that I could sustain that, and it was allowing me to grow my interests and allowing me to question what I was thinking about much more, I felt like I was in a better position to start putting it out there. So sort of 3 years after I finished, I had a group of paintings, and I sent them off to applied to be in this book, which was called 100 Painters of Tomorrow. The work got into that, and that's basically how things started for me. That was seen by Irene, who I now work with at White Cube, and then things began from that. But you know, I've had another good friend of mine who also works in the same gallery is a guy called Eddie Peake. He's an amazing artist. But he had a very different trajectory in that he already, while we were studying, had a huge amount of interest in his work, and had several shows with major galleries going on at the same time. So and other people who I've studied with are still in the position that I was in, and they're still figuring out their practice, or maybe they know what they're doing, they just haven't had a lucky break, you know. Like it's so varied that the only thing that which I think is although it's difficult, I think it's the blessing of it is that you, like, the thing is just to make work, and if you can survive and make the work, great. I don't know if that, I feel like I went off on one on that. Yeah. So.
I actually want to ask a little bit about in this show, the work a lot, you take some references like from Goya for games work. Is it always this practice in your previous work, or how you understand this or awareness of this kind of reference and bring it into paintings?
So, I think the thing with the people that I am referencing is I do love their work. Like they are people I would look at anyway, but they are chosen for. I do keep going back to them in quite specific ways. So Gauguin was very much about dealing with exoticism. Goya is different. He's perhaps my most elusive reference. He's somebody that I'm always drawn to. He deals with incredibly dark subject matter, but with an enormous amount of humour and caricature. And he was also interested in representing what at that time was this sort of new Spanish identity, a sort of Spanish culture that was coming up, you know. And there are sort of like uncanny parallels between elements of our society at home and things that you come across and stuff that he paints with. So I think like there's a lot of things that are just that feel very close. He's also like the most extraordinary painter. And then there's the other artist that I look at a lot is Manet. And with him, like I started to be really interested in him when I was thinking about representing aspects of contemporary urban Kenyan culture and society, and then thinking about what he was doing at that time when he was making work and thinking about French culture in that way. And then there's this thing that he always does where his compositions feel incredibly natural, like they're almost photographic or something, but as soon as you begin to look into them, like you realize how structured they are, and every single aspect of them is totally unnatural. Everything is constructed. And I like that because it kind of made me start thinking that, you know, what I'm doing is bringing a prejudice to every single scene. Everything that I'm looking at is constructed. in that way. So I started thinking about his work and trying to use it and reference him with that in mind. And then some, like I don't really look at that many other artists come and go in different ways. Like I was saying with Degas, but that's such a small thing. I don't even know if it's worth mentioning. But it is just another, as painting is, as you know, like you still what you can.
I just find it really interesting that at the same time you also bring from the pop culture,
Yeah.
feels really makes it really hybrid.
Yeah, it
It
is.
can be anything. The references.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Any more questions?
As you were born in Kenya
Yeah.
and educated in London, how do you identify yourself in between these two so different countries by this series of work?
That is a difficult question to answer. As far as I'm concerned, I'm Kenyan, but I do spend a lot of time in England, and to be perfectly honest, my sort of way of thinking about and critiquing my own work and the different conceptual elements of the work come from a very, very much an English educational system and way of breaking down parts of work. I don't see, on a personal level, I don't feel like it's important that I say that I'm this or that or whatever. I think like there are elements of both that I identify with massively. But in terms of the work, I mean, I think the work is kind of like that. Like you were saying, there are elements of different. Culturally, it's always thinking about Kenya, but there are references that wouldn't exist without having had a Western art education, and thinking about, Western art history or the history of painting in its more diverse sense. Because, like I said, there's also Kuniyoshi is also one of the people I've been looking at a lot in this body of work. So it's it's very varied. I think, and I think that's one of the exciting things of working within culture is that everything that generally things that are kind of turned into an identity of self are made up from very different and disparate cultural origins, and I think that's just I think that's how it is.
One question? I don't know. Well, I think the bugo cloth is something that's very kind of singular in your practice. Maybe you could say, but I don't know whether some of the ones, because obviously some of your paintings you've actually got holes.
Yeah.
Which I think only when you're actually physically in front of the work you can actually see.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you? So do you make a virtue of these kind of imperfections in the composition, or is it do you work against that? How do you?
Yeah. So an example would be like in this painting, if you just look at the base of his feet, and then also the bottom left-hand base of the tire, there are two quite large gashes in the surface in the cloth, and then also along the left-hand side, although you can't see it in the photograph, there's a large amount of stitching, and the same in the top right. There's a square that's put in there with the different sort of imperfections and holes and things in the cloth. It'll often determine aspects of the composition. If I'm thinking of a painting that I want, so like with this type of hole felt quite aggressive because they look a bit like it's been cut with a knife. Although it hasn't. That's what they look like, so I thought it would be fitting for a painting which has a sort of quite a violent narrative behind it. With this painting, it's very difficult to see, but there are also, if you look sort of in the top left quarter, in the bottom right of that top left quarter, there are quite a lot of holes there. And then running along, sort of 2/3 up the painting, running along the whole surface, there's a lot of wrinkles in that. That, when I was looking at this stretcher before I had found the painting, the image to go onto it, I had it upside down, and every time I had an image on it, the wrinkles would interrupt the images in the wrong way. It was only when I turned it the other way around and started thinking of it interacting with the branches of a tree that it made sense to use it like that. So the way that the cloth folds and is cut and has holes and is stitched and repaired really affects the compositions that go on it. And sometimes it'll totally change the image that I start with, because I'll realize that, you know, there'll be too much or too little resistance from the cloth for it to make sense with some aspect of the painting.
So actually, when you got the cloth, it's all naturally there, the holes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the color we talked before the talk, that the color
Yeah.
is also.
Yeah, that's the color of the bark. Yeah. Holiday sang this song, "Strange Fruit." It's about the in the southern states in America, when slaves were hung in the trees by, or in fact it was much more recent than that. A lot of black people and black Americans were hung. There were so many that, you know, some of the images she was talking of the bodies hanging from the trees looking like fruit and looking like an unidentifiable fruit at first hanging in the trees. And she talks about it like about them swinging in the southern breeze, which is kind of beautiful, but horrific. So that's where that comes. That's why "Strange Fruit," which is the title of the song, comes into that.
If we don't have any question, maybe have to really thanks Michael today, and on behalf of the Hong Kong Art School and RMIT, and I have to really tell everybody. So actually, the Michael's show at White Cube Hong Kong is actually open tomorrow, right? Tomorrow night is the opening.
Please come.
So thanks again, and also Susan May from White Cube to bring Hong Kong this great show. Actually, to see the actual work, because the holes, the color, you just have to look.
Thank you so much for having me, and for putting up with me.
Michael, we're all 103 students will be coming to see your show.
Oh, that's,
I know I should warn you.
that would be fantastic. Thank
It's from
you.
6 till 8 tomorrow,
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
And
it
actually,
would be
Michael
lovely
get
to see you there.
really tight schedule. You leave on Wednesday.
Yeah,
Okay.
Wednesday morning.
Yeah. So.
But yeah, it would be lovely to see you. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you.